everyone, and welcome to this session on the challenges facing economic development in the MENA region. Economies across MENA face challenges ranging from political conflict to high debt levels and volatile commodity prices. This has curtailed growth and underscored, yet again, the need for structural reform. Today, we look at the war in Gaza and how it has affected economies across the region. We ask what are the needed reforms and how to encourage private sector investment, boost productivity, and create jobs for the huge numbers of young people who come to the job market every year. Let me introduce our guests first, and on the far right, we have Amitabh Bihar, Executive Director of Oxfam International, and Roberta Gatti, Chief Economist for MENA at the World Bank. On my left here, Professor Ishaq Diwan, Professor at the Paris School of Economics and Director of Research of the Finance for Development Lab. And at the far left, Gonzalo Escribano, Senior Analyst and Director of the Energy and Climate Change Program at the Elcano Royal Institute. So if I may start with you, Roberta Gatti, and we'll have 2 rounds of questions. Please confine your answers to 5 minutes. And I'll start with you, Roberta, please. And I'd like to ask you, how has the war in Gaza, with its regional reverberations, impacted the economies of the MENA region? And what's happened to growth prospects across this region?
Well, thank you, Eba. And this is a very tough question for which to keep an answer to 5 minutes. So let me try just to be an economist here and sort of not talk about the human toll, not talk about the life destroyed, not talk about the deaths, not talk about the displacement, not talk about the famine, but really just talk about GDP. Maybe I can keep it to 5 minutes. So our country economists in the World Bank put the drop in activity in the Strip of Gaza at 86% in 2024. This means that essentially the economy in Gaza is completely stopped. And something that is happening is that what is not stopped, that has actually spiraled out of control, is inflation. And so food inflation is at 300%. And this means that it's really what macroeconomists will call a typical case of a supply side shock. Goods are not entering the Strip. And the little money that is there chases these very, very few goods. And I said I didn't want to talk about all the human impact, but it's kind of inevitable just to put a couple of numbers there of quasi-near famine, and particularly in the north and in the south of Gaza for a large share of the population. More than half of the children below age 2 who do not have dietary diversity, and anyone who's thought about human capital and how you build the productivity and the health of an individual knows how important it is nutrition in early stages. And 685,000 children who have lost more than a year and a half of schooling. This is what is happening in Gaza, but the crisis doesn't stop there. In the West Bank, what we have is actually a drop in consumption. So the macroeconomists in the room recognize this as what we tend to call the demand side shock. So the demand is depressed, mobility is limited, salaries are low. The Palestinian Authority is in a fiscal crisis with a deficit of $1.8 billion, which is twice as much what happened last year. And so the economy is sort of slowed down at the rate of 23% just for this year. We all know that the conflict has escalated and intensified to Lebanon. And I brought here a report that my team produces twice a year with all the economic forecast for 2024, and we're almost at the end of the year, so those forecasts are almost real. But for Lebanon, our economists had to downgrade them from -1%, which was sort of the impact of the conflict that was happening in neighboring countries and just in the south, to -6.6%, which in aggregate, and Professor Ishaq knows Lebanon much better than I do, but in aggregate in the past 5 years means a contraction of 34% of that economy. Now, these are really the tough numbers, but the impact of the war has ripple effects also in neighboring countries vis-a-vis where it is centered. And so what we have seen is that Jordan has been affected primarily so far through a decrease in tourism receipts and arrivals, and Egypt has been affected. It has been affected because the diversion of shipping traffic from the Suez Canal via the Cape of Good Hope has really implied a massive drop in their fiscal revenue in hard currency. Something that is true about the MENA region is that let me figure my geography right, the western side of the region has actually limited trade contacts with the Levant. And so that part of the region has been relatively shielded from this impact.
Thank you, Roberta. Thank you for highlighting the impact. And if I can turn to you, Ishaq Diwan, and ask you more broadly, this is a region which has debt stress, very highly indebted countries that have been trying to reform, reforms stalled repeatedly, and there's always this contradiction between the advice countries are given to cut subsidies, cut expenditure, whereas their rulers or leaders often feel that this will impact social stability. Is there a way around this? Are there reforms that can be made which avoid potentially explosive results?
Thank you, Heba. This is a very difficult question, partly because jumping from Gaza to debt is quite a jump, but also because you ask about debt, financial crisis, austerity, and growth. So that's a whole lot. But just a minute on each, perhaps. Debts are high. Indeed, not in all countries, mostly in the oil-importing middle-income countries. In particular, we already have a debt crisis in Lebanon. There was a debt crisis in Sudan before its civil war. Egypt has a very difficult debt situation, as you said. Tunisia also. Jordan and Morocco are still okay, but have high debts as well. So that's on debt, and so that service is high and squeezes on the budget. And doing nothing, as you suggested, would lead to a financial crisis. Doing nothing, running deficits that keep growing, suddenly there'll be a sudden stop and it would not be possible to borrow anymore. And then, as happened in Lebanon, you are forced to adjust all accounts, fiscal account, external account. Forced adjustment plunges GDP and brings misery and large devaluations and the like. So doing nothing is like going into the wall. It's not the right idea. Austerity is doing something about it, but the very hard way. It's adjusting from below. It's hard to cut expenditure, to increase revenues very quickly, given the fiscal situation, given that the economic situation is tough, and given that the state has actually shrunk a whole lot in the past 20 years. I mean, to just give you a factoid, President Mubarak took the helm when the state was 60% of the Egyptian GDP. And when he left, it was less than 30%. So the whole life was cutting, and so now we're talking about cuts again. So the obvious solution, the miraculous solution, the reformist solution is to grow out of the problem. And so the question is why, as you ask, we haven't seen growth. And it's a good question. We need leadership that favors growth. It doesn't happen by itself. There are growth opportunities. The fact that the private sector is way below potential everywhere, the fact that Europe is friendshoring, and so there are opportunities for industrialization in the region, the fact, I'm sure we'll speak about green growth. We have lots of sun. We can produce green manufacture, which is what Europe and other countries need right now. The technological revolution has not been absorbed and can raise productivity a whole lot if it's adopted well in terms of training and education. And finally, green energy, of course, and regionalism. There's a lot that can be done, that should be done in terms of regional cooperation. So the potential is there, and perhaps being now at the cliff with this very tough choice between, two impossible solutions, crisis, financial or crisis social, finally, some leaders, some political system could really take the lead and reorganize the economy in terms of growth and productivity.
Thank you, Zach. And we've spoken here about the dilemma facing countries that are oil importers and that have big deficits and have to borrow. But if I may turn to you, Gonzalo Escribano, and ask you about the other group of Arab countries, the hydrocarbons exporters, countries that usually are not in deficit, countries that are more comfortable. How they're now under pressure to, the world wants to move away from fossil fuels, they're under pressure to to participate in green transitions. Are we seeing enough effort in this space? Are there contradictions? What do they need to do? Are you seeing diversification at an adequate rate?
Well, first of all, thank you so much to Days for inviting me. Well, that's again a very difficult question. I think it would be important to make a difference between mono-producing oil and gas countries and countries that, being oil and gas producers, they have a more diversified economic base. For countries that are mainly based, their economies are mainly based on oil and gas exports, like Algeria or Libya and others, I think it's going to be very difficult to diversify their economies. I mean, they have not made big efforts either. The problem is when they got oil prices, incentivizing not to reform, and when the prices are low, they don't got the political appetite to reform because the social cost will be very high. So the problem with those countries is, in my opinion, will be in the short term, trying to incentivize green growth, but this is going to be quite difficult because they will need a real deep energy reform, subsidies, competition policies, and permits, even in some cases trade policies, because you need a very agile import scheme. So for those countries, that will be one thing. For countries that are more diversified, I think perhaps Egypt or other countries that you have mentioned, Israel for sure. The question would be, in my opinion, going to the green growth. I don't think green growth coming from trying to export this, trying to replicate this export-oriented extractivist model that we have followed in the fossil industry. I think what some countries are doing, for instance, Morocco, is investing much more in their own decarbonizations. I mean, when you look around in the region, Morocco is the champion of renewables. Their electricity mix is only 20% renewables, more or less, 60% coal. So before thinking of exporting, they should think, in my opinion, to decarbonize and to prepare the ground for a competitive decarbonized industry that can integrate in the decarbonized value chain with the European Union. So we have to change also this extractivist model because if all this, okay, we built a cable between Europe and Africa. We already got one between Spain and Morocco. Spain is exporting renewable energy to Morocco, not the other way around. So let's be realistic and do not raise irrational expectations saying, yes, we need hydrogen, that will be a thing, or renewable export, that will be a thing, because we have already lived that failure of the Desert Tech Initiative and the Mediterranean Solar Plan Initiative. So I think having very accurate expectation will be the best thing.
Thank you. And Amitabh, I would like to turn to you. I think you have You've just been in Baku, right? At the
yes.
COP29? Yes. So I'd like to ask you about the climate crisis, which has been making itself very much felt across the Mediterranean, from Valencia to Derna to droughts in Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. So the Mediterranean is a climate change hotspot. Do you see particular fragilities that are worthy of immediate attention? And how is climate change impacting economic development in that region? Would you say that it's there, the impact is felt, it is not something that we can fear in the future?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And because we started the panel with Gaza, let me just re-emphasize Oxfam has been demanding an immediate ceasefire. And I really hope that today, just probably 50 kilometers from here, the G7 foreign ministers are meeting with an emphasis on Middle East. Let's hope at least the international humanitarian law is respected, it's undiluted, uncompromised. So I hope to hear something positive from there. Coming to your question, I think what's critical to start by saying that it is important to appreciate that the climate crisis has enormous social and economic impacts. That itself is important. And this does not happen within national boundaries. It's regional and global. I think that needs to be underscored. As you said, Europe is the fastest warming up continent. I think we need to recognize that, particularly Southern Europe. What we are seeing is extreme heat, precipitation patterns changing, and you're actually seeing a direct impact on health with clear data of higher mortality in summer. So that's very, very visible. And you talked of the floods in Valencia, but you also have droughts in the same region. So that contradiction is very, very clear. So what we are seeing is this climate crisis is leading to clear challenges in terms of food security, water security, energy security, and certainly health of people. So I was just reading that we even have water crisis now in southern Italy, including in some big cities. And on the other hand, you see in Cannes, you suddenly have massive floods. The Dana took away almost 273 people in just one go. So it's massive. The damages of the climate crisis that we are seeing are here and now. This is not about the future. And it's a massive human tragedy. I was just reading, one of the floods in the region has cost almost 400 million euros, just one flood. On the other hand, UNICEF says 40,000 children's education is getting disrupted, 75,000 house damaged. So that's the scale. But at this moment, I think the preparedness is not there, which is making us more vulnerable. So we need to really start looking at what needs to be done. And I want to talk about 3 or 4 specific things that could be done. But before that, let me just say that we also need to acknowledge that the top 20% of the rich are way better prepared to deal with the conditions that we are talking of. It's particularly the bottom 20% who are more fragile and more vulnerable in this context. 4 specific ideas, and I think these are critical ideas, and you talked of Baku. Hopefully I can talk about Baku more, but let me start. The first one, I think we need clearly greater ambition in increasing emission reduction targets. I think it's important for us to acknowledge that we cannot outsource our pollution. We have a limited carbon budget for the world if we are serious about 1.5% of global warming. And we, as particularly Europe, particularly the Med region, we will need to step up our targets. Second, support adaptation. Yes, mitigation is critical, but all the examples that I talked of, from health to education to food to energy, is about here and now. So we'll need to invest very seriously in adaptation. A lot of conversation remain more focused around mitigation. The third is the centrality of climate justice. People who are getting affected need to be at the center of policy making. They need to be heard. They need to be telling us what the solutions are. Whereas what I see, you're increasingly even seeing restrictions of civic space. You're seeing where particularly climate activists are not even allowed to share their concerns. And finally, and I think this is pretty much speaks to the heart of our argument as Oxfam, that we need greater leadership on climate action from the region. As in, we were looking at the pact that we have here, which is the Mediterranean Pact, which is essentially talking of security as the fundamental lens. It is a geostrategic, geopolitical lens to the pact. The climate word is missing from there. I think we'll need a fundamentally different way of understanding what compacts are at this juncture, where climate has to be central. And we need to get out of this extractive, exploitative model and look at a fundamentally different model of designing the pact. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Roberta, let me come back to you with another question about conflict. Again, looking at MENA, MENA has been racked by conflict for decades. We've had Iraq, we've had the Algerian Civil War, Syria, Yemen. There have been many conflicts, and how much has been lost in terms of economic development, and is that something that can be quantified or even imagined?
Again, a tough question, but I think it acknowledges the fact that the current war comes at the heels of an increasing fragility in the MENA region. And so if you look at the MENA region starting from the 1990s, you find that the episodes of wars have increased twofold in that period, and the number of victims of these episodes of war has increased by 6 times. And you know, between 2012 and 2018, the MENA region was claiming the top place in terms of the largest share of fatalities in the world, and this was during the conflict in Syria. Now, as I mentioned before, there's much more to the consequences of war than what happens to GDP. Human lives are lost. Life's trajectories are affected forever. Infrastructure is lost. Societies are changed. But we tried to do an exercise which I kind of felt was at least like informative, just to get a sense of how much is lost in terms of what we call development. So that's GDP. And so we looked at the conflicts that you were mentioning, and we created like a counterfactual economy of how that was similar to the economy that had the conflict at the beginning, so pre-conflict, and tried to compare the GDP per capita of this fictional economy, but similar, and the real one that was afflicted by war. And so what we came up to is actually a very large number that is lost all the way up to 7 years after a conflict. The MENA region has lost 45% of GDP just in the economies that were afflicted by conflict. And we compared it to how much was gained over the past 50 years in the region. And this is equivalent to 35 years of development. So there's a sense in which conflict really dials back development. I think a famous economist, Paul Collier, called it development in reverse. So it's inevitable to think that peace is a precondition for development. But if I may conclude on a bit more optimistic note for the region, like many of you spoke about important things and important reforms that the region ought to embrace to grow. And here, thinking about conflict, I have to say peace is a precondition, but this is a region that has a tremendous potential for growth. And at the World Bank, we always come up with titles like unlocking the development, unleashing the development. And I don't think it's because we lack imagination. It's just because it is really this sense that there is a potential there that needs to be harnessed for growth. And if I may conclude here, I would focus on two things. One is really to bring more women to the workplace and sort of abate those barriers that do not allow women to participate to the economy, and really embrace those reforms that allow the private sector to grow and create jobs. That's one. And the second one, and all of you have spoke to it to some extent, is really to increase productivity, not only to shrink not exactly to shrink the role of the state, but to change the footprint of the state from the sort of primary character in the play to an actor who can really create the enabling environment for growth. So I would focus on that. I think technology, and Ishak was speaking to that, is something that would be technological progress that would be important in the long run, but that won't come unless there is like data transparency, open data access, and a free circulation of ideas in the region.
Thank you. So a loss of 35 years of...
35 years of development just because of those conflicts.
And of opportunity to all the young who come into the job market, and
with consequences that really perpetuate over generations. Yes.
Right. Ishak, let's focus on one country here, which is Tunisia. Tunisia has been in economic crisis for a few years, even before the political change under Qais Said. Tunisia has debt, mounting debt. It has also spurned an IMF program. What do you see happening there? And is there a way Tunisia can escape a difficult fate?
Thanks, Eva. This is a good question, because Tunisia represents very well what I was speaking about before. But if I may, maybe I can do Tunisia in 2 minutes. And I wanted to respond to, I was inspired.
Yes, please.
We're hearing about this region where there is regional violence, where there is climate warming, global warming, and climate challenges, where growth is low. And we could think a little bit on the long term. Growth is the solution, but what type of growth? What type of challenges? If the world, abides by the Paris Agreement and gets to net zero in 2050, which we all hope it would gradually consume less and less oil over time. Right now, the region receives about $1 trillion of oil revenues a year. And so ideally, we would say for the good of the world, this number should go down every year now and gets to close to zero by 2050. Now, imagine this scenario in the region today. We're talking of violence, we're talking of crisis. This is times 1,000, right? The pie is shrinking. Countries will start fighting with each other so that they produce and not their neighbor. What kind of regional order we're going to have? Nobody would want to invest in this situation. And yet, every country is losing oil revenue, so they need foreign exchange to import their food, so they need to diversify. Yes. And every country is diversifying on its own. Very hard to imagine this successfully. So we can imagine easily a terrible future. And if we don't want to have this terrible future, we better start thinking today about another future. And this other future is one of focusing on the economy, on diversification, on cooperation, on doing it perhaps together into a regional market that can attract FDI for a large market. So we need to think completely differently and convince civil society and convince decision makers and parties that the future is very grim unless we start thinking differently. So that was inspired by perhaps
Can I interject something
these
here?
Things together.
And it's really a question. Can you do any of this in countries where societies don't have much of a voice?
Much of?
A voice.
A voice. I don't think so, personally. But, I mean, the Chinese are being successful, very successful. And I don't see in our countries, except perhaps the young princes in the Gulf, that this model will be successful. 2011, 19 have shown with civil society in the street that people want a voice. And so I hope this can happen. Do you want me to answer Tunisia still?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, Tunisia is a good example of why political, if not change, at least political dialogue is needed to resolve a problem, because Tunisia is in a trap of its own making. Its debt is high, as you said, 100% of GDP, debt service is high, growth is low, and so this is a pretty bad situation. Debt is high because deficits are high and keep adding to the debt, and deficits are high because the government wants to provide a safety net because things are bad, and so subsidies are very high. It's like 12% of GDP, it's enormous. And so this adds to debt. The government cannot borrow outside anymore, markets have closed, so they have to borrow domestically. They crowd out the private sector. They ration imports because there's no foreign exchange, and so the industry cannot function. And so growth is very low, and there's high unemployment, and nothing on the shelves. So you see, it's a trap, right? I put a very expensive safety net in order to deal with growth, and growth is very low because this is eating all my resources. Unless you have a proper political system discussing this and how the different, the unions, the economic elite, the state can coordinate getting out of the trap, I don't see this happening. We have a very strong leadership, but somehow not very much aware of these issues.
And yet every year we hear predictions that Tunisia will default and somehow it scrapes by.
No, I don't think default is a solution because not much of the debt is, external private debt that you can just default on. A lot of it is multilateral, and much of the debt is domestic and with banks. So Tunisia is going the Lebanon way now. It is, unless something is done soon, it risks a triple crisis, external, domestic, fiscal, and banking.
Right. Thank you. Dire warnings for Tunisia. Amitabh, if I can come back to you and ask you, developing countries are demanding that developed economies maximize their efforts in terms of climate finance. The recent G20 in Brazil did not send a promising signal. You've come back from COP, so how do you assess what's been achieved there?
So should allow me to start with a very brief personal anecdote. I think must be 5 months ago or 6 months ago, I was in a small town called Renk. This is at the border of Sudan and South Sudan. And we have humanitarian work in that region. And I was sitting at the border post, and every 15 minutes, it was a devastating day for me. To experience it firsthand, it is devastating. Every 15 minutes, I would see 3 or 4 families coming, refugees and returnees from Sudan to South Sudan. But what was quite a shock to me is that a significant number of them were not just escaping conflict, but actually they were climate refugees. And once you've experienced this, and what we just talked, as in my previous response, I was talking about what's happening in the region here. With that context, what we have seen in Baku is a disaster. We have come back hugely, hugely disappointed. As civil society, what we are seeing, what happened in Baku, and let me also say that some of the people were saying this is not such an important COP. However, I certainly believe that with the focus on climate finance, it was one of the most important COPs. And what we have seen is a very, very dismal result. Civil society, with all its calculations, and the numbers are there, was saying that we need at least $5 trillion of climate finance looking at the climate debt, particularly of the north to the south. That's what the numbers were. The developing countries were saying it has to be $1.3 trillion. And please let me underscore, $1.3 trillion of grants, not of mixed finance. And what we have eventually got, what was the offer, and even the process was quite haphazard, what we finally end up with just $300 billion of mixed finance. That's what we have got, which is quite devastating. With the climate catastrophe all around us, and what does this $300 billion of climate mixed finance talk of? It talks of bilateral, multilateral market, but also the carbon market.
Also?
The carbon market. What does carbon market essentially do? It transfers the responsibility. It in no way is helping us address the question of limited carbon budgets. The way we are exhausting our carbon budget at the moment, the world is exhausting. At this pace, the carbon budget would be over by 2029. And we are talking of carbon markets as one of the sources, which is really not a solution. On the other hand, we are then looking at loans, and we already heard about debt, what debt is doing across developing countries. You don't have social security, you don't have investment in public health, you don't have investment in basic education, and all the money is essentially going into debt servicing. So, but let me also say, you talked of G20, and I would actually flip it. At least as Oxfam, we have read the G20 communique with enthusiasm. There's a clear commitment to tax the super rich. And I'm bringing that to say that the money is there. We can actually find the money, the trillions of dollars that is needed, and that is through taxing the super rich. There could be windfall profits to tax the polluters, the large corporations which are responsible for this. So I would really say that the struggle is on.
1.3 trillion, was doable, you would say?
Absolutely, it is doable, and we have the numbers. We can present the numbers, how it, even just with what the UN Tax Convention is discussing and what the G20 is proposing, we can actually achieve the numbers. It is really lack of political will, which is not giving us the numbers at the moment.
Thank you very much. And my final question to Gonzalo Escribano. It's again in same area of climate change and energy policies. The global cooperation appears to have come to a dead end. In the face of national security demands, the risk of green protectionism between blocs cannot be overlooked. We're already seeing some of this. Do you think that this is MENA countries can cope with? Can they develop industrial and trade policies, given that they depend on hydrocarbons to a large extent?
Difficult question again. Well, first of all, I don't like the term green protectionism. Nowadays in Europe, we don't use the green word anymore. It's clean. So at least let's talk about clean protectionism, but it's not that unfair, you know. Yeah, that's a problem, but please let's try not to forget, as has been just mentioned, the Mediterranean is a hotspot of climate change.
Yes.
It's a key issue for human security. People is dying. It's not only about people dying, but also about mobility. That is very, very high. In some projections, by 2050, we don't do nothing. Some areas of North Africa will become unhabitable for human beings, with all the repercussions that will have on livelihoods, on migration, and other issues. But the main important thing, in my opinion, is human security. So these countries in the South are the most interested in preventing climate change by mitigation policies, but also adaptation policies. So we can think about green growth in mitigation policies by installing more renewables and more energy efficiency and so on and so forth, and there are opportunities for growth there. but also in adaptation. I mean, we need to reinforce infrastructures, and there is a lot of activity that can be created there. But for this, what we need is to get a policy package. What we cannot do from the European Union is saying, yes, as you said, we don't give you money, but you have to do the homeworks. Yeah, hey, listen, all these countries, they got their national determined contributions. What they are going, the pledges they made to improve renewables and to deploy renewables are conditional to financial and technological cooperation from the North. So it's in both shores of the Mediterranean interest to develop a good system for green growth. What we at Elcano are proposing, that is exactly what the CBAM, the Border Carbon Adjustment Mechanism, means, is what we call not nearshoring, not friendshoring, but green shoring. What the European Union is doing is let's give a competitive edge to those economies that are able to decarbonize faster, deeper. And if they are closer to the European Union, in principle, if they got the correct policies, they should have a less carbon footprint than, integration of value chains with Asia or other countries. So I think CBAM is an opportunity for those economies to incentivize their decarbonization, but also to achieve a model of competitive decarbonization. That is precisely what we at the European Union are proposing. So trying to integrate these both strategies across, we can call it whatever you want, clean shoring if the European Union doesn't like the word green anymore. But I think this kind of integration is what we'll have to look forward in the coming years and decades if we really want to promote green growth and at the same time prevent the human and ecological disasters in the region.
You think it's being sufficiently promoted now? Or?
No, I don't think so. We lack finance, and we lack a clear narrative, what the European Union really wants. I mean, it's not that we want to protect our industries and just that. No, it's that we want a carbon level field, if you want to call it like that. And for this, I think there are opportunities for countries that are close to the European Union.
And 30 seconds.
Yes, please.
I mean, I totally agree with you that this is a good long-term strategy, but in the short term, it is protectionist and it will hurt your neighbors. So why not use the proceeds of the tariff, the customs, the revenues, to support that transition with your neighbors?
There are technical limitations on what you can do with the money you get with CBAM. There are a lot of academic studies on that. What will be the most efficient measures to improve this? The main result is promoting and financing energy efficiency in those countries. That will be the more effective. But due to the structure and the legislation of CBAM, it's not that easy. I get that money from here and I put it here. So we will have to work on that. I agree with you that that should be doing, but it's not that easy because there are technical constraints on how can you allocate the proceedings of CBAM.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of minutes. Does anyone want to contribute anything? Any final remarks?
Just to underscore one point which I missed, that and it's been made by the panel, that when I was talking of the 1.3 trillion, again, the emphasis on adaptation. We need to ensure that adaptation is at the center. Yeah. Because the developing countries do need those resources. I think that is quite central to the conversation. And the Loss and Damage Fund, which was created last year, a success of the previous COP in Dubai. However, the numbers are again extremely small. So as an idea, it's been germinated, but it needs now serious investments.
I just wanted to add a perspective rather than a point. I think that we spoke a lot about green energy and industrial policy, and probably the greening of our economies and going towards net zero is like the most important industrial policy that we should think about in MENA. However, we can't forget the fact that there's no substitute for a conducive business environment. And this really means the sort of certainty of application of the law, simplification of the law, sort of like a changing the footprint of the state in a way so that the state really creates the sort of competitive neutrality between state-owned enterprises and the private sector that can really make the sectors of the future or of the present, among which the green one is a fundamental one, to really flourish. So I think this is something that we should always keep in the back of our minds for the Middle East and North Africa.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you,
May I
everyone.
just add a single sentence? I fully agree with that, but I think also that we need to work, more on a, how to say, it's difficult to me to put it in words, but the energy transition and decarbonization is institutional intensive. So we need improving the institutional settings, institutional frameworks, in order to attract foreign direct investment. It's not like oil and gas. Oil and gas investment, you do it in the worst environments you can do, but renewables and decarbonization, no. You need predictability of regulation, you need, other things, a much better institutional development. And this is another area on which perhaps some cooperation will be needed.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fascinating discussion.
Thanks, Eva.
Thank you.
Good to meet you.